swag vibe, baby.
Welcome to the Cup of Joe Show, where we explore the journey of recovery from alcohol and drug addiction. One story, one conversation, and one step at a time. I'm your host, Joe, creating a safe space for honest discussions about the challenges and triumphs of addiction and alcoholism. In each episode, we'll hear inspiring stories and uncover tools that make healing possible. Sobriety is not a one-size-fits-all journey, and you don't have to face it alone. Recovery is possible, and it's worth it. Thank you for joining the Cup of Joe Show. Now let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Cup of Joe Show. I'm your host, of course, Joe, and today my guest is Joe K., who not only has a great name, but he's celebrating 19 years of sobriety since his clean date of July 11th, 2006. Joe's transformation is nothing short of remarkable, earning a GED behind bars and now holding a Master of Science degree and stepping into a new chapter as a dedicated professional. The youngest of four, Joe spent nearly 2 decades healing relationships, especially with his parents. Today, he walks through life with gratitude, integrity, and zero resentment. He's also recently engaged to his fiancée, Jennifer, and together they're building a life and a home. A passionate dog lover, Joe's faithful companion, Jake, is the fifth in a lifetime of loyal friends. As he says, a man's life shouldn't be measured in years, but in dogs. When he's not working, you'll find Joe outdoors, hiking, traveling, and finding God in the great outdoors. Joe's story is proof that recovery can rewrite the ending. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's get into it. Joe, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. I am blessed. It's good to be here with you.
Well, thank you for taking the time. So what was it like growing up, Joe?
Well, I am blessed. I know a lot of people have a lot of trauma in their story, and that just isn't my story. I'm fortunate in that regard. I guess just the typical traumatic events growing up, nothing too extreme. But I grew up in a small town in Southern California. I actually still live there. I was born and raised here, and I was the youngest of four. I was the only boy, so I was, as my sisters like to say, I was spoiled and loved the most. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they say. And I was born in the early '80s, and life was really good. I don't remember anything extravagantly difficult. I remember riding my bike through the fields. Like I said, it was a small town. There wasn't a whole lot to do other than get dirty in the fields or watch the trains pass on the train tracks. And man, I loved growing up and riding bikes. And my parents were middle class. My mom was a registered nurse. My father was a firefighter, which kind of molded me in a way because I'm in the medical profession now. But I was a latchkey, or was a latch lock kid growing up. My mom would work 12-hour shifts and my dad would work 48-hour shifts. So I had a lot of time by myself. And, it was great. Climbing trees, eating cherries out of the trees, walking through the orchards. Life was really good growing up. I grew up Catholic, and I have nothing against the Catholic Church whatsoever. I actually love the Catholic Church. I have a few Catholic tattoos on me as well, and I loved it. Actually, I was an altar boy. I loved going to church on Sundays, and I believe that was a very spiritual experience for me as a child. Seeing the stained glass windows and the reverence in a large Catholic church. And I really loved it. And, I think one of the most traumatic things that happened to me growing up, and it really affected me severely, was my parents got divorced when I was about 10 years old. And it was kind of an ugly divorce. My mother drank a lot. I don't know if she was an alcoholic, because she found God later in life. and stopped drinking. And she's a totally different person now today. But she drank a lot when I was growing up, and she wasn't the nicest person. And my parents' divorce when I was about 10 really, really, really affected myself and my older sisters. And right about that time, I stopped going to church, about 10 years old. My parents were too busy in custody battles and fighting with one another to pay a whole lot of attention to us. Like I said, they were both really busy with work. And then I think their divorce consumed them with a lot of anger and resentment. And we were kind of pawns as children. And it really, 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 really hurt my soul, my spirit. Deep down, it wounded me. And coincidentally, that's right around the time that I discovered alcohol. Now, stepping back a little bit, my dad was a firefighter, like I said, and he worked out in the desert and in a little itty bitty gold mining town. And he was the captain of this fire department. And the 395 runs right by this, which is a highway. Highway 395 runs through through Randsburg is where he worked. And a Carlo Rossi truck jackknifed and lost the whole load. And my dad's totally a normal guy, doesn't drink abnormally at all. But the truck driver said this is a total loss. The insurance company is going to pay for everything. So all of the unbroken bottles, feel free to take. So my dad loaded the back of his patrol truck up with gallon bottles of Carlo Rossi and brought them home. So my garage had probably 30, 40 gallons of Carlo Rossi in it. And I was about 10 years old. And that was like my first drink. I remember I was about 10 years old and we went camping, and it was that typical experience that I hear a lot of people sharing about. I'm not a high shelf drinker. I'm kind of a low bottom drinker. And that's how I started. It was Carlo Rossi. It was a solo cup, half Carlo Rossi and half Shasta Cola. That was my first drink. And I was 10 years old, about 10 years old, 9, 10, 11 years old. And I drank 3 or 4 of those. And I remember feeling what I hear so many people talk about, that warmth within themselves, that sense of ease and comfort, right? That calmness. I felt peace like throughout my entire body. And I remember the fire was more vibrant. It was warmer. I was singing around the campfire. I think I was all alone. I don't remember a whole lot. I came to the next morning in my tent. So I must have blacked out that first drink as well. And, so it was a pretty amazing discovery, at 10 years old, this magic potion, alcohol. And, I didn't have the obsession of the mind, but the allergy was there. I have never been able to take a drink without developing the phenomenon of craving. Ever since I was 10 years old, I took that drink and I immediately wanted more. And I always drank like that. I didn't necessarily have that obsession to drink yet, but every opportunity I got to drink from that point forward, I took. And like I said, at 10 years old, my parents' divorce greatly affected me, and I was hurt deep within. And I discovered that drinking, and this is in hindsight, I don't think I necessarily recognized it as a 10-year-old, but I discovered that in hindsight, that drinking calmed the storm within myself. And all of that pain seemed to evaporate. All the loneliness seemed to evaporate. And that, that warmth around the campfire, all of that came to me. It was a great medicine, and it worked really, really, really well. I mean, who wouldn't chase that? Perhaps a normal person, but I wasn't normal. I wasn't normal at all. And, it wasn't a problem at first, but it shortly became a problem after that. Tehachapi's a real small town. That's where I grew up, in a little small town called Tehachapi. And there's not a whole lot to do. And I didn't get into a lot of trouble at first, but I remember my 7th grade year in junior high, I stole a bottle of it was horrible stuff. I don't know how I drank it. It was like a melon liqueur or something. It was nasty stuff. And this green liqueur, and me and my friend Larry went out and we were going to go drink it before the school dance. And I took a big chug off of it and I passed it to Larry. And I guess Larry was normal because he took a big chug off it and was like, oh, nasty. And he didn't drink anymore. And I finished that bottle in the next few minutes and went to that school dance. And I was obviously intoxicated, and all the teachers and faculty were able to see that. And I got suspended for being drunk at a school dance. And that was the beginning of trouble, and the trouble progressively got worse. My freshman year in high school, I started going to juvenile hall. I started getting arrested for public intoxication, minor in possession of alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. And my freshman year in high school, I got expelled from high school for various reasons. And at that same time, I discovered the Grateful Dead. My oldest sister is 5 years older than me, and my two middle sisters are identical twins, and they were real good girls, and they did real good in school, straight A students. But my older sister, man, I loved her, and I loved her friends, and she was wild, and she partied, and her friends were all skaters and snowboarders, and they all smoked herb and dropped LSD and drank a lot. And I really, really found that attractive. And I discovered the Grateful Dead. And I got expelled from high school. And naturally, like any 14-year-old kid, I got grounded. I got grounded for the whole summer. But by the time I was 14, I had a mental obsession. And I was full-blown alcoholic, if you will. And I could not be grounded. I mean, how could you be grounded, when you have that mental obsession? So naturally, I ran away, and I decided to tour the Grateful Dead. That was the decision I made. And I wasn't the typical runaway. A lot of kids would, I hear, they'd run away and they go across town to a friend's house. But I started leaving the state. I started hopping freight trains. I started leaving the state and trying to hit these Grateful Dead shows, and usually I made it into a couple of them. Usually I was just extremely intoxicated in the parking lots, and so that's kind of how things went. I ended up living on the street for the next 12 years. From 14 years old till about 26 years old, I lived on the street. Shortly after that, Jerry Garcia died with the Grateful Dead, and I was about 15, so it was about a year later, and I took off the tie-dye, and I started wearing a little darker colors, and carrying my skateboard, and I kind of went a little punk rock on the street, and I'm a Skid Row variety drunk. I don't mind sleeping in bushes. I don't mind sleeping in abandoned buildings, sleeping under bridges. So that's kind of what I did. And I ended up in the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington. And I lived for the next 12 years on the street. And I remember, and it was still working, I was still enjoying it. I think a lot of people would think that was too much for them. But I remember I was 17 years old, and I think this is kind of funny. Some people do. Some people would think this is horrible, probably. But I remember I was in Seattle, Washington, and I was 17 years old, and I was a runaway still, and I was under a bridge. It was raining, and I had a gallon of Carlo Rossi that I had panhandled enough for, and I had a steak that I stole from the supermarket, and I flipped over this shopping cart, and it was barbecuing a steak on the shopping cart. And I remember thinking, I have got it made, because it was freedom, life was full of adventure. I had no responsibility, and I chased that for a very, very, very long time, that I wanted to take no responsibility whatsoever. And freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. I chased freedom, and I chased not having any responsibilities. And later on in life, today in hindsight, I could see how bound I was to myself, that bondage of self. But yeah, it was still working. I was under that bridge, cooking up that steak, drinking out of that gallon of Carlo Rossi, and it only got worse from there. I remember I was like I said, I kept getting arrested as a juvenile. I started getting arrested as an adult. A week after I turned 18, I was facing 13 years for grand theft auto, leaving the scene of an accident, multiple felony charges, and I thought it was a joke. I laughed at the judge. I said, you don't have enough evidence to convict me. I was very, very arrogant and foolish, and luckily I only got like 90 days for that. But the next year, I spent 11 months in county jail on 5 different offenses. And I remember the last time I went to county jail, the last time I went to court, Judge Eckert, God bless his soul, I don't know if he's still alive. He was friends with my grandfather. And he said, the next time I see you, because they were all petty offenses mostly. And he said, the next time I see you in here, even if you spit on the sidewalk, I'm going to give you a year and a day. And I was there for a public intoxication, and I got a 6 months. I got 6 months sentence for a public intoxication. And I was like, oh my goodness, right? Next time he sees me, he's going to, and he said, I knew your grandfather, and if your grandfather was still alive, he'd kick your ass. And he's true. It was totally true. If my grandfather was alive, he would have kicked my ass, but he wasn't. And the judge found it necessary to tell me that. And so I decided I would start going to jail elsewhere, is what I decided. And that's when I ended up in Portland, Oregon, and in Washington, because I didn't want to go to jail. And the nice thing about Oregon is that they had budget cuts, and they weren't prosecuting misdemeanors. So the beer was free in my eyes. I could walk into stores and walk out with a 12-pack or a 24-pack. And if I got arrested for public intoxication or petty theft, they would lock me up for 24 hours, 72 hours, throw me in a drunk tank, and then kick me out as soon as I was sober enough to leave. And I estimate, I don't know how many times I was arrested, but I estimate I was arrested 50 times. And I thought it was a joke. I thought it was funny. I knew I was an alcoholic. I didn't necessarily know what that meant in hindsight. I wore it as a badge of honor. My friends would call me crazy, and I wore that as a badge of honor as well. And I ran amok, long story short. But it started to turn on me, and I was 21 years old. I was barely legal to drink, and I had already been living on the street for the most part of the last 7 years, and I was 21, and I was up in Portland, and I was in Laurelhurst Park. I remember it. And that day I must have had 3/5 of Captain Morgan's, I believe, and whatever else I was drinking. And I had insulated this bush with brown paper bags, and I was living in bushes, and I remember being insanely drunk. Thank God I was insanely drunk, because I decided I was going to hang myself that day in Laurelhurst Park. And I took my belt off, and I put it around my neck, and I hoisted myself up in the tree, and I passed out and dropped it and came to on the ground, cursing God, taking another drink. And I tried that 3 times before I just decided to finish the bottle. Like I said, luckily I was too drunk to be successful. But that's how I drank for the next 5 years. Every day I prayed that God would end it, and I didn't care how God would end it. I just wanted it to stop. Death would have been fine with me. But every day I drank. And that's how I prayed, and that's what I thought. I thought that God should just strike me sober, or God should just remove it, like without any effort upon myself. And I would pray that way. God, help me. Gulp, 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 gulp. God, help me. Gulp, 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 gulp. And I was willing to do nothing about it. And I continued to drink. And it was a very, very, very dark and miserable next 5 years. And most of that was a blackout. I don't remember literally years. It was just a blur. And I ended up in the rooms of recovery. And thank God, once again, I ended up back in Southern California, and I had no intention on getting clean and sober. And, backing up, I ended up in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 14 years old, right when I got expelled from high school. A friend's mom in the program saw that I had a drinking problem, and she brought me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I thought it was a joke. I just wanted to get that 89-cent quart of King Cobra. I couldn't wait to get out of there, and I kind of laughed at them. But that was my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And then living on the street, I ended up in quite a few meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, mostly to get out of the rain in the Pacific Northwest, to get a hot cup of coffee, definitely not to get clean and sober. But I knew that Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and 12 steps existed. I didn't necessarily know what it was all about, but I knew it was there. And I ended up in a meeting, and I had no hope, actually, that Alcoholics Anonymous would work, or the 12 steps, or that God was going to help me in any way. I thought that this was my lot in life, and these were the cards I was dealt, and I was just going to have to take it to the bitter end. So that's what I was going to do. But I found myself in a room, in a recovery room, and the reason why I went is because there was this cute girl in AA, and I wasn't going to get sober. I wasn't going to get clean, but I was willing enough to go to a meeting to chase this girl, and that's how I ended up in the room of Alcoholics Anonymous. My character defects brought me to Alcoholics Anonymous. God used my character defects against me. Thank God. But it was thousands of prayers, prayers that I prayed. I'm sure prayers that my mother and father prayed, and countless and countless and countless prayers for me, that I found myself in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I decided I wasn't going to drink. I could look at the steps on the wall, and I could read them, and intellectually I could comprehend them. Yeah, I should be honest. Yes, love is good. Yes, forgiveness. These are all noble spiritual, concepts. I could understand that, but I just had no ability to apply those to my life. I just could not apply spiritual principle to my life. So it wasn't going to work for me. But I decided I wasn't going to drink that day because I wanted to impress this girl. And something pretty remarkable happened. God put the right people in front of me. God had been doing that for a very, very, very long time, but I ignored it. But the right people were placed in front of me, and people started to extend their hand. And in that first week, I got a sponsor. And I didn't ask him to be like, I was incapable of doing that. What really happened is there was this lady named Jenny, and Jenny kind of intimidated me. She was an older lady. She had years of recovery, and she asked if I had a sponsor. And I'm one of those guys that'll just tell you what I think you want to hear, so you'll leave me alone. I think a lot of us are that way. And Jenny asked me if I had a sponsor, and I said no, but I'm thinking about it. And I had no intention, right? And she said, okay. And then she found me at another meeting, and she said, have you thought about it? Have you gotten a sponsor? And I was like, no, but I'm thinking about it. No intention of getting a sponsor. And she said, I think you should ask that guy over there to be your sponsor. He's got great recovery, and you should ask him to be your sponsor. And I was like, yeah, let me think about that, And she said, on the break, I want you to go ask him to be your sponsor. And I was like, okay. It was a speaker meeting, and there was an intermission after the 10-minute speaker. So the break came and gone, and I did not go talk to this gentleman. I didn't ask him to be my sponsor. And after the meeting, Jenny cornered me, and Jenny asked if I asked him to be my sponsor, and I said, again, no, I'm still thinking about it. And she grabbed me by the hand and walked me up to this gentleman. And she didn't say anything. She just kind of introduced us and walked away. And I was shaking. I was trembling a little bit because I don't know how to be vulnerable, and I'm afraid. I have all of these fears that I haven't discovered yet and I haven't faced. And but I was in front of this person, and I knew that I was supposed to ask him to be my sponsor, and I did. And he asked me if I was willing to go to any length for victory. I told him yes, because that's what I thought he wanted to hear. And he said he would be honored to sponsor me. He would be honored to be my sponsor. And that same night, another thing that Ginny did for me, Ginny saved my life. If it wasn't for Ginny, I wouldn't have gotten a sponsor. I would have probably died a long time ago. But Ginny also railroaded me into my first commitment. So at that meeting, she nominated me to be the vacuumer after the Tuesday night speaker meeting. And it was like my first resentment in AA, and I was annoyed, like why do I need to vacuum? And I remember vacuuming that night. And I was annoyed, and I was pushing the vacuum, and I was cleaning things up, and I was just annoyed with it, And I remember thinking, if vacuuming would have gotten me sober, I would have bought a vacuum a long time ago. This is stupid. But the people that came before me knew better than I did, thankfully. And the second week, I remember pushing that vacuum and being just a little less irritated. But I remember it was the third week, and so I was about 30 days clean and sober, and I was that third week as the vacuumer, and I was pushing that vacuum, and it hit me very heavily that I had a calmness within me, that something was happening, and my sponsor was taking me through the first step. And through the big book, and I had this sense that something was happening, and now I know what was happening. A miracle was taking place. God was doing for me what I couldn't do for myself. That prayer that I used to pray, God help me, gulp, 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 gulp. I realized that faith without works is dead, and that if you want to recover, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I started to do the work, and I had that calmness and that sense of peace within me, and that was the beginning of a pretty amazing journey. My sponsor took me through the 12 steps, and it was a profound awakening. I remember the third step, I remember that awkward. I still had that awkward feeling, with my sponsor, because I didn't know what intimacy meant. I thought intimacy was chasing women. I thought intimacy and lust were synonymous, right? I didn't know that I could have an intimate relationship with another man. So I was with my sponsor, and we read the third step, and we got to that third step prayer. And he said, okay, let's get on our knees and hold hands and say the third step prayer. And I remember feeling extremely awkward and uncomfortable. But I did. I got on my knees and I held his hands, and we had our books open, and we read the third step prayer together. And man, I had this sense, again, another sense of relief. Like I was on a path that wasn't my own, that was true, that was tried and true. And I had this sense of that something was happening, that something bigger than myself was going on. And, I started that fourth step. And I was oblivious to the process still. I was still relatively full flight from reality. I still was holding on to my resentments a little bit. I mean, of course, I was only like 90 days clean and sober, so I hadn't dealt with them yet. And I'm writing down this fourth step, and I remember feeling justified with all of my anger. I'm writing down this resentment list, and I'm like, this person did this, and this person did that, and I behaved like this, and this is why I behave the way I behave, because of all of these people and how they treated me. That's how I've lived my whole life. And my sponsor, and I did that fear inventory, and I did that first sex inventory to the best of my ability. I've since had to do, inventories again to be a little bit more thorough, because I did the best I could, but more shall be revealed. But I did these the best I could. And I was doing my fifth step with my sponsor. And when I was justifying all of my resentment and all of my ill behaviors, and this is why I act the way I act, and look at what all of these people did to me and all of these institutions. Look how hard it is for me. And he asked me, what part did I play in that? And I had never considered that my whole life. And like I said, I was oblivious to the process, and I was taken aback. I was like, oh no, because it hit me kind of suddenly. What was going on was, finally, after years and years and years of dodging responsibility, I realized that I was going to have to take responsibility. And what was my part in it? And I was like, oh no, this is going to open up a huge can of worms. How did I get here? What am I doing? And that was the beginning, of a great discovery of misplaced emotions. For years and years and years, I acted inappropriately in the moment because I had these misplaced emotions and resentments from the past that I did not deal with appropriately. So I carried this resentment and this ill will from the past into my everyday life. And it bound me to myself, and it filled me full of hate and resentment and bitterness and drunkenness. And I started to look at those things, and I started to look at my character defects and shortcomings, in 6 and 7. And I to the best of my ability, again, I humbly offered myself to God, and I asked him to remove all of these, and I started to make that 8th step list, to make amends. And that was difficult. There's a lot of fear, it was a fearless moral inventory. And I don't know if it was fearless at all. I was, there was a little bit of fear there, like the unknown. How are people going to react? But I made that 8-step list, and I shared it with my sponsor, and we discussed making amends the appropriate way, staying on my side of the street and being responsible for my part, and how can I make this right, and doing everything I can not to injure anybody else again. And I started to make those amends, and it was amazing. Relationships that were, I thought, irreparable started to mend. At the top of my list was my mother. How I said she was mean growing up, and she drank a lot, and she wasn't a kind person when I was a child. And I despised her and resented her. I drank a lot over her. And I started to own my own behavior. And when I went to make amends to her, I left all of her stuff out. It's none of my business. I was only responsible to bring my side of the street, to keep my side of the street clean, and to bring my part to the table. And I made amends. And since then, I've had the most beautiful relationship with my mother. And I still make amends on a daily basis because I want to have healthy relationships. And that's just one example. But there's many, many, many others. And steps 4 through 9 is, in my opinion, the meat and potatoes. It's about me looking at myself honestly, me taking responsibility, and me doing everything I can to make things right and to live a different life. 10 is I continue to do that. And when I'm wrong, I promptly admit it. And I love God, and I have different beliefs about God than I did when I came in, and it's an evolving relationship. But God is amazing. And the 11th step is powerful. I've learned how to meditate in recovery. I have a hard time keeping my mind quiet. So meditation isn't the easiest process. I do a lot of hiking, and I love to be outside and to watch the breeze pass through the trees. And I do meditation, like mindfulness and breathing techniques and these different meditation techniques. And I love it. And I love prayer too. And, there's so many different avenues to God. There's, Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't have a monopoly on recovery. Neither does Narcotics Anonymous. And, the reality is, in my opinion, is that it's all about my relationship with God and my relationship with other people. And I think that's what the 12 steps is all about. It's about relationships. It's about the relationship I have with myself. It's about the relationship I have with God. And it's about relationships I have with the people around me, which I believe are the image of God. I believe, there's this great spiritual writing, without quoting it, and it says, if I'm going to offer gifts upon the altar to God and realize I have wronged my brother, first I should set aside these gifts, make amends to my brother, make things right with my brother, and then offer my gifts upon the altar. And that tells me that my relationships with my brothers and sisters around me is vital to having a healthier relationship with my Creator. And how can I claim to be spiritually fit if I'm constantly stepping on the toes of my fellows? I can't. So that is my best gauge on how well I'm doing, is the relationships that I have around me. And some days are better than others, but it's a work in progress. And then carrying a message. There's so many different ways to carry a message, working with others. And I know it says, carrying a message to alcoholics and practicing these principles in all my affairs, but man, there is a message to be carried everywhere I go, whether it's just kindness, opening the door or being kind in the grocery store, practicing patience. There's wherever I go, there's a message, and I have to be aware that it's easy to carry a very negative message as well. So I try to carry a message. I try to be of service, and this way of life is by far greater than the life I was living before, and my life was transformed. I'm a high school dropout. I say dropout, but I actually got kicked out. So I didn't really drop out. They asked me to leave, and when I got clean and sober, I decided to go back to school. And it was one of those things, this guy named Pete, thank God for Pete. Because recovery removed all of my excuses. Pete taught me this. And I was talking to Pete after a meeting one day. I want to go back to school. I want to go back to school. And Pete was like, well, go to the community college, sit down for the placement exams and start taking a couple classes. And I was like, that's a great idea. I'm going to think about that. Right. Just like I said to Ginny. And I was the next week later, and Pete asked me, so did you go to the college? And the community college was about a 45-mile drive. And I was like, no, I'm going to. And it was another week later. Did you go to the college? And I made an excuse. I said, no, I just I didn't have the gas money to go. And that was the wrong thing to say, because Pete pulled out his wallet. And he said, how much does it cost to get your car to the college? And I was like, oh no, he pulled my excuse. I was like, I don't know, $10, $15. And you know the story from there. He gave me $10, $15, and I felt guilty. I no longer had that excuse. So I went to the community college, and I sat down for my placement exams, and I started taking courses, and I started to apply these principles everywhere I went, like at school, one day at a time, first things first, et cetera, et cetera. I just went to one class at a time. I took one test at a time. I turned in one assignment at the time, and before you know it, I had an associate degree. And then I had another associate degree, and then I had a Bachelor of Science, and I just graduated with my master's. And I don't know if I'm going to go further than that. School's difficult, and there's a lot of work to be done. But man, how can somebody like myself, who lived in bushes, kicked out of school as a freshman in high school. I ended up getting my GED from Laredo County Jail, like you mentioned, and to go from that to a master's degree, and then when I got clean and sober, I had 11 convictions. I got arrested countless times, but I had 11 convictions, and the profession I chose to get into, it was going to be real difficult getting into that profession with convictions. So I ended up doing the same thing. I went to the courthouse one day at a time. I served papers to the public attorney or the district attorney, probation, and I ended up getting all of those convictions expunged and dismissed one at a time. And my record's clean today. I lived on the street for most part of 12 years, and I bought my own house about 10 years ago. I just sold it. My fiance and I are building a house right now. So, it's like everything has like done a complete reversal since I've come into recovery and started to apply spiritual principles in my life. And, it's just, there's no life I would rather live. I was afraid of intimacy. I didn't necessarily neglect that first sex inventory, but just word of advice, anybody listening, take that very seriously, because I had to revisit that multiple times in recovery, because I started to realize that my relationships weren't up to par. And I was responsible for a lot of the discord, and I had to revisit that and make amends. And today I have a healthy relationship. I'm engaged. I asked my girlfriend to marry me a few months ago, and she said yes. And so she's my fiance now. And and this is somebody that couldn't have a meaningful relationship, a lasting, meaningful relationship with anybody. Somebody that lived in bushes, uneducated, unemployable. And, I've been in the profession that I've chosen to be in for the past 13, 14 years now. And I am doing, it's just amazing, what recovery does. And when I rely upon God and trust God and have faith that God will do for me what I can't do for myself, and am willing to do the footwork, it's amazing what happens. So I am beyond grateful to be here. I'm excited to see what else happens in recovery. Life has become a great adventure. I realized doing my fourth and fifth step that I was plagued with fear. I didn't realize that before because I was too drunk to recognize it. And I discovered, I always would hear people say that we must replace fear with faith. And I always struggled with that because there was always a little bit of fear still there. I could never replace it entirely. And I heard this one guy, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I ran with it. I heard this one guy, he was a out of towner, and he stopped by our meeting hall. I never saw him again. He said something that I needed to hear. And he said, I don't replace fear with faith. I embrace it. I embrace fear with faith. And that made more sense to me. So, when I'm afraid of things, I embrace it, knowing that in hindsight, through experience, God has carried me through over and over and over and over again. And now I've discovered that when I walk through my fears, life becomes a great adventure. And man, recovery the 12 steps have made my life meaningful, and it has given me purpose. So I don't know if I could add anything more to that, Joe, but.
Well, I think you've done pretty damn good, if you ask me, Joe. I think it's in the name. I don't know. I'm just.
Joe's a good name.
Good name. It's an amazing story, Joe. And so what's a typical day like for you now? Like, what does your recovery day look like?
Well, one of the things I was told early in recovery that helped me develop a very, very, very good habit was I was told to go to 90 meetings in 90 days. And I did that for years. I think the first 5 years I averaged a meeting a day. So I still try to do that. If I'm not working and I'm not have engagements or responsibilities, I make sure I'm in a meeting because that's where I need to be. I also make sure I always have a commitment because that saved my life. But aside from that, my dog, Jake, he needs 2 walks a day. So I gotta walk Jake at least twice a day. Man, my life has been so busy. Like I'm starting to have a little bit of free time. I was working 2 full-time jobs and doing a bachelor program at the same time. I've had to learn that moderation is good, and I don't moderate very well. A little workaholic, and I get a goal in my mind, and I get a little tunnel visioned. So I'm trying to moderate a little bit more. My fiance does not want me working 2 full-time jobs ever again, and so I work a few days a week. My days off, I try to relax. We're in the middle of building a house that occupies a lot of my time. I just try to I try to look at the beauty in life. I try to, like right now, I'm looking out this window and it is sunny. There's not a leaf moving on these trees outside. I have a bunch of oak trees outside my window. There's always deer walking through my yard. There's a cat sitting on the table with me right now. I just try to live in the moment and to recognize how blessed I am and try to practice gratitude, to live without resentment. And, that's kind of what I do on a daily basis.
So what would you say to somebody who maybe is out there listening who is feeling hopeless right now?
Well, I felt hopeless. Like I said, when I came into the rooms, I had no hope in recovery. I thought it was a joke. How could this possibly help me? How silly. But what I discovered was that if I got busy and I started to do what was suggested, regardless of how silly I thought it was, the results started to manifest. Hope is an amazing thing. I am so filled with hope today, and I wasn't at one point in time. And the reason why is because at first it was a lot of blind faith. And blind faith is difficult for me because I'm just blindly trying to trust something that I don't understand, that I can't comprehend. And it's difficult for me. But after that, I started to build experiences, and I started to see where God was carrying me through, whatever God is, right? And as time has gone on, and I've built more and more and more experiences, my faith has become more profound. Like I know that God will carry me, and I know that God will carry me through anything. And that's the other cool thing, is that there's a lot of people that don't have a whole lot of hope, that are hopeless. And let me tell you, it gets different. It changes. But they have no hope in God, or they're agnostic or atheist. And it's okay to be agnostic or atheist, or to not understand, because our journey with spirituality is evolving from my experience, and your beliefs might change. Your beliefs might not change, but I've discovered if I'm open-minded, I discover so much that I did not know. And I discover how wrong I was. I was so wrong. Thank God I was wrong, because AA is not going to work. This isn't going to work for me. This is my lot in life. I'm going to take it to the bitter end. I was so wrong about all of that. So if people are having a hard time or have little hope, I would suggest that they get a sponsor, that they go to a lot of meetings, that they get taken through the steps, that they read whatever literature they choose to read that will guide them on a spiritual journey. Now, I know my experience is biased from a 12-step perspective, but there's so many different avenues to recovery, and God can be found in so many different places. I would just suggest that they keep an open mind and be willing to do what feels foreign to them, to be willing to step into the unknown, to have a new experience.
That's beautifully said, Joe. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to talk about, or anything that you?
I don't know. I think I covered most of it for the most part.
I think you did too. I think you covered it pretty well. And I appreciate you doing it, and telling your story and sharing your hope. I think, you know, you got sober at 26. Is that right? Am I
Yes,
right?
that's
Am I calculating right, Joe?
you are. Yes.
Was it how difficult was it to be young and get sober?
Well, I don't think it was too difficult. I think the alternative would have been death. I think I had drank enough where I knew what that side of the street looked like. But what happened is I got a sponsor, like I mentioned, and I got that commitment, and I had no intention of doing those things. And my sponsor started taking me through the steps, and the obsession was lifted. And since the obsession has been lifted, drinking and using isn't an issue at all. Now I have to have healthy relationships. I have to practice honesty and integrity and forgiveness. I have to practice spiritual principle. Drinking and using isn't a problem. So when it comes to physical recovery, no, I don't struggle today. Thank God. I guess sometimes spiritual recovery and emotional recovery is difficult because life sucks some days, right? People die, animals pass, we lose jobs, there's divorces. Like, life is difficult. We get older and frail and we die, it's like, but I have to look. So it's hard. It's difficult sometimes to be optimistic and full of gratitude when the world feels heavy on my shoulders. But that is a part of life, and I have to. For me, I just have to. That's what integrity is all about: doing what is right, regardless of how I feel, regardless of what's going on around me. So I think it was just my time to get clean and sober. I had drank enough, I had used enough to be willing to do what I was told to do.
Fair enough. You reminded me of a guy, old guy Tom Wells. He's passed on now, but he used to always say, if my sobriety is dependent upon the way I feel, I'm in a world of shit.
It's the truth. It's very true.
Yeah. Well, I can't let you go without doing our rapid fire questions. So if you are ready, Joe, no pressure.
I'll try to keep them brief.
Right.
I talk a lot, as you noticed.
It's all right, man. All right. What is your favorite recovery slogan?
Wow, my favorite. There's so many. To thine own self be true. That's a powerful one. Let go and let God. Like I mentioned earlier, first things first. I used to see all those slogans on the wall, and they were always arranged. It was live and let live. Oh, that's one of my favorites too. Live and let live. Let go, let God. First things first. Think, and what is the last one? But for the grace of God, I think. I don't know.
Easy does it.
Easy does it, yeah.
Yeah.
And they were, thank you. And they're in a specific order, at least an old timer told me once. And it was the first word of all of them. And it was supposed to be in this order, they said. And they said, what was it? It was live easy, but think first. And I love that. But I think live and let live is a great one. You know, I do believe in powerful relationships with those around me. And I believe that what other people do isn't a lot of my business. And if I could live peacefully amongst my brothers and sisters, I could live a pretty joyful life.
What is your least favorite recovery slogan?
My least favorite recovery, you know, this too shall pass. I used to hate that one because, you know, an old timer will always bring that up. You know, you're having a horrible day and they're like, this too shall pass. And you're like, whatever. Or you're having a great day. This too shall pass. A funny story. I was 5 years sober. It was on my sobriety birthday. And my girlfriend, it's funny now in hindsight. It wasn't at the time, although I did chuckle a little bit. My girlfriend at the time broke up with me on my 5th birthday and gave me a gift. And it was a shirt of a guy getting run over by a train. And it said, this too shall pass. I thought that was funny. But yeah, and then you could always start your day over. I used to hate that one too. Fake it till you make it. You know, I hated that one too. But I discovered how I don't hate those anymore because this too shall pass, right? I can always start my day over. I had to practice that one the other day. My day was going not so good, and I had to pause and pray and just start over. And fake it till you make it. I couldn't understand what that meant until I heard my grand sponsor share one time, Joe, if you act like a gentleman, nobody will know the difference. And I was like, oh, that's what it means. Like, so if I act like a gentleman, nobody will know the difference. Fake it till you make it. You know, so that has become powerful for me as well. You know, if I act as if, I will become. So if I act spiritual, who will know the difference? But yeah. So.
No, that's well said. It was well said. So, what do you think is your sobriety superpower?
Goodness. I love perseverance. I think that is a spiritual principle behind the 10th step. And, it takes a lot of perseverance when you make goals in recovery, regardless of what they are, if it's going to be buying a house or going back to school or just making it through the steps, one step at a time. It takes a lot of perseverance, living a spiritual life one day at a time. And, I've made quite a lot of goals, and I've held myself to a high standard, and I know nothing happens without God, so I put my faith in God, and I trust that if God would have me go in a different direction, he'll guide me in that direction. And I've persevered through a lot of difficulty. I had a lot of trouble at first because my background and past convictions and all of this, and I just was steadfast. I just kept walking forward in recovery, and I just trusted that God would carry me through thick and thin. And so I think perseverance, I've practiced that pretty well.
If you could say one thing to your former self, what would it be?
I think I would tell myself that I love you. I love you because I was so hurt as a child, and I did not feel loved. And a lot of the wreckage I created was because I didn't care. I thought I wasn't worthy of love. I thought I didn't deserve love. I thought that I was just a rotten egg, I guess, if you will. So I would just reinforce that I love you and that it's okay and it's going to be all right.
What song do you play to lift your spirits when you need a boost?
What song do I play? You know, I love music. I listen to so much different types of music. I love country. I was, you know, I talked about the Grateful Dead, and then I went punk rock, and then you know, I love reggae. I think reggae is beautiful. You know, it's always got a pretty positive spiritual message. But I think I could pretty much turn on any music and be lifted. You know, for the most part. I mean, obviously there are some songs that are a little bit more hardcore, but man, music is so beautiful.
I was waiting for the Touch of Grey, Grateful Dead. That was the best.
Oh.
Grace when you mentioned Grateful Dead, the best I could do on that one. But it's all good. If you could grant yourself one wish to help with your recovery, what would it be?
One wish to help me with my recovery. It's interesting because this definitely isn't me. And this isn't me probably most of the time because I'm still plagued with selfishness and all of those things. But the first thought that came to my mind was, how can I help somebody else? So if I could have one wish that would help me in my recovery, it would be to more effectively relay the message of recovery to other people. You know, so that I could impact other people in a more profound way.
What step do you love the most?
Man, well, any given moment, I have to practice any one of those 12 principles. You know, I love, you know, because that's what they really are. You know, there's an underlying spiritual principle with each step. I love prayer. I love the 3rd step, the 7th step, the 11th step prayers. You know, that's difficult. I think my recovery is pretty meaningless if I don't offer myself to God, if I don't humble myself to God, and if I don't try to improve that relationship with God, praying for knowledge of His will. So 3, 7, and 11 are pretty tied because without those, it's really difficult to have healthy and meaningful relationships with my brothers and sisters, with myself. So
You're really going to enjoy this next one then, Joe. What
Uh-oh.
step do you love the least?
You know, I don't think I could answer that. You know, during the process, 4 was difficult because I don't like to write. But that impacted me probably the most. So I mean, I love that. I had to come to terms with my sanity, right? So step 2 was very important, and you know, came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. Step 1 is hard to swallow, you know, when you're new, because I thought I'm an alcoholic, but I'm going to have to manage. You know, that's what I thought. You know, I'm an alcoholic. This is my lot in life. I'm going to have to manage. So it's really difficult to admit that I'm powerless and that my life is unmanageable. That's a difficult step for a lot of people. And that's why a lot of people drink and use themselves to death. I can't really say that I dislike any of those at all because they've transformed my life. You know, 19 years ago, it might have been a different story when I was walking through it for the first time. But man, I don't think I dislike them at all.
I hear you. Now remember, I said, which one do you love the least? I didn't say dislike people. I just want to make the record clear. I'm just kidding, Joe. So, what is one of your favorite movies?
I am a Quentin Tarantino fan. I'm also a Clint Eastwood fan. I love Unforgiven. But that is it's a great story. I don't know if people haven't watched that. It's a great Western. I'm not gonna give it up for you. You should go watch it. Spaghetti Western. But it's long story short, it's a cowboy that gets clean and sober for his wife, quits drinking, starts living the good life, and then down the road takes a swig and due to resentment and creates quite a bit of wreckage. But it's an amazing. I love Clint Eastwood. I think Unforgiven is probably my favorite movie.
Great movie, Joe. And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gate?
You know, I've thought about that before. Not necessarily what I would like to hear God say, but you'll hear people say, "What question? What are you going to ask God when you get there?" And I think I'm going to be so profoundly amazed by God's glory and grace that I'm going to probably just bow down before him. I don't think there's anything I need to hear. I don't think there's anything I need to ask. I think I'm going to be so overwhelmed with love and gratitude that nothing else will really matter. So I don't think I'm going to need to hear anything. I think the angels will be singing, right? And I think God's radiance will be the light, and no questions will need to be asked, and nothing will need to be said.
That's a pretty amazing answer, Joe. And I really appreciate you taking the time today to share your experience, strength, and hope. And I know some people are going to be helped by what you had to say today. So thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. And I hope that at least one person's helped anyway.
100%.
I was helped. I'm going to stay sober today. So
me and you both. How about that?
Hey, we helped each other. That's all that matters at this point.
It's a pretty good deal.
Yes, it is.
So for the rest of you folks out there, please subscribe to our friends at thedailyponderables.com, your recovery source for inspiration and encouragement every day. A new episode of The Cup of Joe Show is released every Thursday at noon. You can visit thecupofjoeshow.net, or you can listen to the show in your favorite podcast apps, Podbean, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and others. Just search for The Cup of Joe Show. Don't forget the. Like, follow, subscribe, and share, because someone out there needs to hear this today. Thanks for listening, everybody.
It's just a laid-back vibe, baby.
We hope you enjoyed today's experience, strength, and hope. We are so grateful you decided to join us. Please share this episode with someone who might need it. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. Remember, no matter where you are in your recovery journey, you are not alone. Reach up and reach out to someone. Please do not suffer in silence. Until next time, let's take it 1 minute, 1 hour, and 1 day at a time. Thanks for listening to The Cup of Joe Show.